Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into a concept that's been getting a lot of attention in India. You've probably heard of it. It's called one nation, one election. Basically, the idea is to hold elections for the Lok Sabha and all the state assemblies all at the same time, like one giant nationwide election festival. When I first heard about it, I was like, wait a minute, haven't we done this before?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because India actually did have simultaneous elections for a while, from 1952 to 1967 to be precise. It was a period of, relative political stability, but it eventually fell apart, mainly because some state assemblies were dissolved before their terms were up. That kind of messed up the whole synchronized cycle. And, well, that's how we ended up with the staggered system we have today.
So it's kind of like a blast from the past, but
Yeah.
with a modern twist, right?
Yeah.
But why all the hype now? Why is everyone talking about bringing the system back? What's the big deal?
Well, there's a whole bunch of arguments in favor of one nation, one election, or ONOE, as some people call it. People who support it say it could lead to a more efficient government, make elections way cheaper, and even get more people excited about voting and participating in the whole democratic process. They think that aligning those election cycles could totally change how India approaches governance and democracy as a whole.
Okay, I see where they're coming from, but that sounds like a pretty big claim. I'm guessing there are a lot of details to consider here. Let's break it down. First off, the idea of a more efficient government.
Right, so think about it this way. Right now, with all these elections happening all the time, the government's practically always in campaign mode. They're constantly trying to win votes, which means they often end up focusing on things that will get them elected in the short term, instead of focusing on long-term goals and policies that might actually be better for the country as a whole.
It's like they're trying to run a marathon, but stopping every few miles to pose for a photo op.
Exactly. Onori would free them up to actually focus on governing. It would give them the space to really get stuff done, to implement complex policies, and to actually tackle those long-term challenges. And that could lead to more consistent and effective governance overall. There was this example during the recent elections in Ghaziabad in Uttar Pradesh. Over 24 development projects were basically put on hold. Why? Because of the model code of conduct that kicks in during elections. Imagine how much that kind of delay must be happening all over the country.
Wow, yeah, that's a pretty clear example of how the current system can actually slow things down. Okay, but what about the cost? How much money could we actually save by doing this?
Oh, the cost savings could be huge, seriously. Just to give you an idea, the 2019 Lok Sabha elections, just those elections alone, cost a whopping 55,000 crore. People who are for ONOE say that holding all the elections at once could save us anywhere between 7,500 crore and 12,000 crore. I mean, that's a lot of money. Think about it. That's money that could be used for things like healthcare, education, infrastructure. We could build schools, hospitals, you name it.
Yeah, those numbers are pretty eye-opening.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about where our priorities are. But it's not all about the government and the money, right? I've also heard people saying that ONOE could actually get more people to vote.
Oh, absolutely. Voter fatigue is a real thing. People get tired of constantly having to go out and vote, especially for all those local and smaller elections. It can lead to lower voter turnout, which isn't good for democracy.
Yeah, I get that. If you're only voting once every few years, you're probably going to pay more attention and be more invested in the whole thing.
Exactly. ONOE is all about making those elections feel more important, more impactful, and potentially getting more people to participate and have their voices heard.
Okay, so more efficient government, big cost savings, and potentially more people voting. Are there any other reasons why people are supporting this idea?
There are actually a few more, and they kind of get into some of the less talked about aspects of the current system. Some folks argue that ONOE could help reduce electoral malpractices, stuff like vote buying or using government resources for campaigning. Think about it. The more elections we have, the more opportunities there are for these kinds of shady things to happen. Just recently, during those state elections and bypolls, they seized over 8,000 crore worth of cash, alcohol, drugs, and freebies. All that stuff was being used to try and influence voters.
Wow, yeah, that's a little unsettling to hear.
Exactly. And with ONOE, there'd be fewer elections, which means less time for those things to happen. And it would be easier to keep an eye on things and enforce the rules.
It sounds like there's a lot to gain in terms of like cleaning up the electoral process. So we've got efficiency, cost savings, voter turnout, and even potentially less corruption.
Oh, and don't forget about security. All those elections put a huge strain on our security forces. They have to deploy so many people and resources to keep things safe and under control.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The Election Commission needed something like 3.4 lakh Central Armed Police Forces personnel just for the 2024 Lok Sabha and some state assembly elections. With ONOE, they could deploy those forces more efficiently and maybe even free up some resources for other security needs.
So it's like streamlining the whole security apparatus around elections, making things more efficient.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got efficiency, cost, voter turnout, less corruption, and even security benefits.
And one more thing, the economy.
Oh, right. How does that fit in?
All those frequent elections can actually disrupt local economies. There are all sorts of restrictions that get put in place during campaigns, and that can affect businesses, transportation, even liquor sales, believe it or not. The Karnataka government, for example, lost out on 150 crore in revenue because of the liquor ban they had during their state elections in 2023.
Wow, so these temporary election rules can have a real impact on the economy.
Yep, and the idea with ONOE is to have fewer of those disruptions. By aligning all the elections, you create a more predictable environment for businesses and for the economy as a whole.
So it's like creating a more stable and consistent economic playing field.
Okay, so it sounds like ONOE is being presented as a solution to a lot of different challenges.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
But I'm sure there are people who aren't so thrilled about this idea. What are some of the concerns that people have raised about one nation, one election?
Oh, there are definitely some valid concerns, and we'll dive into all of that right after this. I think one of the biggest worries people have is just how complicated it would be to actually make this happen. I mean, India is huge and diverse with tons of people and different levels of government.
Right. Where do those complexities come in?
Well, first of all, to really do this right, you'd probably need to change parts of the Indian Constitution itself. Specifically, the parts that deal with how long the Lok Sabha and state assemblies are supposed to last and how they can be dissolved.
So we'd be messing with the fundamental rules of our democracy. Pretty much. And that brings up a whole bunch of questions like what happens if you have to shorten or extend the terms of some state assemblies to get everything synced up? Is that really fair? Does it actually reflect what the people want?
And what about those times when a state government collapses before its term is over? Would we have to just wait for the next big election?
That's another tricky one. You could use Article 356 of the Constitution, the one about president's rule, to handle those situations, but that might look like the central government is grabbing power, which wouldn't be good for democracy either.
It sounds like trying to make this work without messing up our Constitution would be a real balancing act.
Absolutely. And speaking of balancing acts, a lot of people are worried about what this would do to India's federal structure. They think it could make the states less independent and give more power to the central government.
That's a serious concern.
Hmm.
How would ONOE threaten federalism exactly?
The worry is that with everyone focused on one big election, national issues would drown out local ones. People might end up voting based on what's happening on the national stage instead of what's important in their own state or community.
I think we've already seen hints of that happening, right? Like in 2019, when the Lok Sabha elections and the Odisha Assembly elections happened at the same time, almost all the talk was about national issues. Important things in Odisha, like problems with agriculture and unemployment in tribal areas, didn't get much attention.
Yeah, exactly. And some people are afraid that this could make all political discussions kind of the same, like a one-size-fits-all approach. Regional issues and local voices might get lost in the noise, which wouldn't be good for a country as diverse as India.
So we've got potential problems with the Constitution, worries about federalism, anything else.
Well, don't forget about the logistics, which would be crazy complicated. I mean, we're talking about over 900 million voters, potentially a million polling stations, all happening at once.
Wow, yeah, that's hard to even imagine.
It would be a huge undertaking. The Election Commission says they'd need something like 10,000 crore every 15 years just to buy and replace all the EVMs. And that's just one small piece of the puzzle. You've got to find people to run the polling stations, make sure everything is secure, transport all the materials. It could be a logistical nightmare.
I can see how it could stretch our resources pretty thin and maybe even create security risks.
Right. Some people are worried that we wouldn't be able to manage an election this big without making compromises on security, which could open the door to fraud or other problems. And then there's the stress it would put on our existing infrastructure. There could be delays, disruptions, even mistakes.
So it's not just about whether we can do it, but whether we can do it well.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of accountability. Right now, those frequent elections force the government to answer to the people pretty regularly. Voters get a chance to see how their elected officials are doing and kick them out if they're not happy.
Right, that's how democracy is supposed to work.
But if we have fewer elections, some people worry that we'd lose that regular check on the government.
So it's like the government wouldn't have to listen to the people as much.
That's the concern. If people have fewer chances to vote, they might feel less powerful, and the government might not feel as much pressure to do a good job.
We've seen how important that public pressure can be, right? Like in the 2022 Punjab Assembly elections, the government was voted out because people were unhappy with their performance.
Right. That kind of direct accountability might be harder to achieve with fewer elections.
Okay, so potential problems with the Constitution, worries about federalism, logistical headaches, and concerns about accountability.
Don't forget about the political side of things, too. A lot of regional parties are really against this idea.
Why is that?
They're worried about losing power. They think that in a big national election, their voices would get drowned out by the big national parties. Regional parties often focus on local issues and identities, which might not get much attention in a national campaign.
They see this as a threat to their power base and their ability to stand up for their regions.
Pretty much. And without the support of those regional parties, it would be really hard to make Onawi happen.
It sounds like getting everyone on board, from the big national parties to the smaller regional ones, would be essential for this to work.
Absolutely. And then there's the question of what happens if a government collapses unexpectedly. Like what happened in Karnataka in 2019 and Maharashtra in 2022. Both of those governments fell apart, and they had to hold new elections.
How would we handle those kinds of situations if we had a synchronized system?
That's a tough one. You could either impose president's rule, but that might damage people's faith in democracy. Or you could hold separate elections, but that defeats the purpose of having simultaneous elections in the first place.
It's a no-win situation.
It highlights the need for a system that's flexible enough to deal with unexpected events without throwing the whole thing off track.
Okay, so we've got a whole list of challenges here.
Yeah.
But before we get into potential solutions, I think it would be helpful to see how other countries have handled this. Are there any success stories out there that India could learn from?
That's a great question. And there are actually quite a few examples from around the world where simultaneous elections have worked pretty well. There are, and some of them are pretty impressive.
Really? Like who?
Well, Indonesia is a good example. They switched to a one nation, one election system back in 2019.
So they went all in on this idea. How did that work out?
It's actually been going pretty well. In 2024, they pulled off what's considered the world's biggest single-day election.
Whoa, that's huge.
Yeah, they managed to coordinate voting for something like 200 million people.
And get this, it wasn't just for president and parliament. They also had regional elections happening on the same day.
It was a massive undertaking, but they made it work.
I'm curious, though, what was their secret? Did they face similar issues to what we've been talking about?
They definitely had some challenges, but they tackled them head on. They planned everything super carefully, invested a lot in infrastructure, and made sure to educate voters about the whole process.
So it's like being prepared is key.
You got it.
Makes sense. But Indonesia is just one country, right? Are there any other examples?
Oh yeah, there are a few others, like South Africa, for instance. They vote for their National Assembly and provincial legislatures at the same time, but their municipal elections are separate.
So it's kind of like a mix and match approach.
Exactly, a hybrid model.
I wonder if something like that could work for India, given our federal system and all that.
It's definitely something to think about. That kind of model could be a more practical way to transition to a synchronized system without causing too much disruption or taking away power from the states.
It sounds like flexibility is really important here.
Absolutely. Every country has to find a way to make this work within its own political context.
Okay, so we've seen that simultaneous elections can work, even in large and complex countries. But let's bring it back to India. Given everything we've discussed, all the pros and cons, what are some realistic steps we could take to actually make this happen?
That's the big question, isn't it? One idea that's been floating around is to start with pilot projects in India's union territory.
Oh, that's interesting. Why there?
Well, places like Delhi, Puducherry, and Chandigarh have smaller populations and simpler governments compared to the bigger states. It would be easier to test out ONOE in those places, see how it works in practice and iron out any kinks.
So it's like a trial run before we roll it out nationwide.
Exactly. And speaking of rolling it out, another idea is to do it in phases. Maybe start with regional synchronization.
What does that mean?
Well, instead of trying to synchronize everything across the entire country all at once, which would be a logistical nightmare, We could start by synchronizing elections within specific regions.
So like start with the South, then the North, that kind of thing.
Yeah, something like that. It would be a more manageable approach and might help address some of those concerns about overwhelming the system.
It makes sense to take things one step at a time.
Right. And we can learn from each phase, make improvements as we go along.
Okay, so pilot projects, phased implementation, anything else?
Oh, and of course, we can't forget about technology.
Yeah, technology seems like it could be a game changer here.
Imagine a single platform for managing all aspects of the election: voter registration, polling booth allocation, candidate filings, real-time data, even the result. It would streamline everything and make the whole process more transparent.
That sounds amazing. But is that even possible?
It's definitely within reach. And we could even explore things like blockchain technology for secure voting and maybe even online voting for certain groups like NRIs.
Wow, those are some really innovative ideas.
Technology can make things a lot easier and more secure, but it's important to remember that it's just a tool. The key is to use it responsibly and ethically, without compromising data security or voter privacy.
Right, we don't want technology to create new
Oh,
problems.
absolutely.
Okay, so technology can help with the practical side of things. But what about those concerns about federalism? How do we make sure that regional interests don't get ignored?
That's a crucial point, and there are definitely ways to address it. For instance, we could make regional debates mandatory during those synchronized elections, give those local issues a platform. And we could also set different spending limits for political parties in different regions. That way, regional parties wouldn't be at a disadvantage compared to the big national parties.
So it's about creating a level playing field, making sure everyone has a fair shot.
Exactly. We could also have decentralized election monitoring cells where local authorities oversee the process in their own areas. That would make things more efficient and responsive.
It's like having local experts on the ground who can handle things quickly and effectively.
Precisely. But even with all these measures in place, we can't forget about the most important element: the people.
Yeah. Ultimately, it's all about the voters.
We need to talk to people, get their feedback, understand their concerns. We can have public consultations, online polls, even citizen assemblies to make this a truly participatory process.
Absolutely. One nation, one election affects everyone, so everyone should have a say.
It's about giving people a voice in shaping their own democracy.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the history of simultaneous elections in India to the potential benefits and challenges, the global experience, and even some practical ideas for implementation. It's clear that this is a complex issue with no easy answers.
It's multifaceted, and it requires thoughtful discussion and a willingness to find solutions that work for all Indians.
And that's what we've tried to do today, to provide you with the information and perspectives you need to form your own informed opinions. So what do you think? Is one nation, one election the right move for India? We'd love to hear your thoughts, share them with us in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going.
Remember, learning doesn't stop here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those deep dives coming.
Thanks for joining us.